What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the second episode of the Zay Knows Ball podcast. I'm happy to be back. Long week of basketball. You guys know the deal. Welcome to Zay Knows Ball, where the game makes sense, even if sometimes my takes don't. All right, so last week we talked about the NBA Finals and what that meant for two small market teams and how that's just going to affect the ratings of the league. This week, we're going to be going down to the collegiate landscape where there's been some big news within NIL and the transfer portal and that whole mess. So, obviously, as we do every week, we're going to start with the deep cut. And this week's deep cut focuses on some news that is supposed to be put into effect on July 1st of 2025. There has been an overall settlement between the NCAA and specific organizations that allow the schools to directly pay their players. So first, before we get into any of that, I'm not here to break down the legal jargon and what it specifically means. I'm kind of just here to make some sense in terms of what it can mean for the actual product on the court and how it can affect the transfer portal. So there are plenty of videos out there legally explaining what this may mean and the certain specifics about it. I am not here to do that. Let's continue. So let's set the record straight. I know there are a lot of people hearing headlines about college athletes getting paid or the NCAA settling for $2.8 million, but don't really know what that means or how we even got here. We're not really just talking NIL money anymore. We're talking about schools. So, like I said, starting this summer, schools are directly allowed to cut checks to players, like up to $20 million a year per school. That's never happened before. But to really understand why this matters and why the NCAA is spending hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars to lobby Congress right now, aka convince them to pass certain laws that can still put the NCAA in some sort of power and not make these student athletes, quote unquote, treated like full employees. So, to understand this, you have to go back. So, even dating back over decades ago, the NCAA built its entire system around the idea of a student athlete. And that word could be a trigger for some because the word is sort of counterintuitive within itself. It's sometimes even an oxymoron where the student part is used to diminish how fairly these athletes can be treated or even them being treated as an employee. The student, again, gives the connotation that, these people aren't really employees. They're people who are just members of this organization and might not deserve the benefits or whatever, what have you, as employees in the real world or the workforce. So fast forward. In 2021, as we know, the Supreme Court cracked the door open for something big. NIL comes in, and athletes are able to get paid, not specifically from the schools, but they're able to get paid from third-party vendors, whether that be sneaker companies and other places or advertisements that are able to pay them, but not directly from the school. You get it. Nike, State Farm, all these other endorsements that you see, Cooper Flag and Juju Watkins and used to be Caitlin Clark, all these people that you're used to seeing. But they weren't allowed to make any money from their school. Now in 2025, the NCAA agreed to settle a major lawsuit that can specifically pay players. Now, these are checks that are coming from the schools. So that makes me think, obviously, there are a bunch of other questions that are going to be brought up. How are they going to divide this $20 million equally for each player? Or how are they going to determine people's value? And a lot of this stuff is still up in the air. But the major question is now, how are these schools going to use the quote-unquote leverage that they have in terms of actually being able to give these athletes contracts now? And with the idea of contracts, not every athlete is required necessarily to sign a contract, but for these larger profile athletes, these schools like Duke and Kansas and Kentucky, they may give incoming prospect Deron Peterson, let's use Deron Peterson, the number one player in this upcoming class from Kansas, they may, but he's also a one and done, so he doesn't necessarily apply here, but we're still going to use the example where if they give him a contract to where, okay, you have to stay at this school for at least 2 years, hypothetically, and if you want to leave, you either have to fill out this buyout or this school has to buy you out for you to get out this contract or for you to transfer. So that kind of changes things because obviously we are used to, within at least the past 2 years, the transfer portal being this, again, depending on how you feel about it, but it's been a lot. And it's been compared to the NBA free agency just because of how many people, it's reported over 2,000 college basketball athletes have transferred, men and women. And it's been just used as this where players are kind of just leaving whenever they feel like. And again, it's brought a lot of mixed discussion where a lot of fans think that these players are kind of running from the grind, quote unquote, and not staying where they started. And there's no real form of loyalty to any of the schools that they've committed to anymore. On the other hand, people think, again, this is more of a way to enforce player empowerment and players are really being able to do what they set their eyes on doing because, again, they are the ones bringing most of the revenue to these top schools. So it's interesting. Again, the schools now with contracts could potentially have leverage with these terms, with these conditions, and again, even buyouts. That could be the first real test for coaches and maybe how they feel about a broken transfer system. So now, if you're able to put contracts in place, maybe it's less about, okay, let's make sure that guy A, B, or C doesn't transfer. Because again, for top prospects, this may not apply much because most of these guys are going to be one and done anyway. But more for the guys that they are trying to keep and develop within this 4-year time frame, there can be ways that you can keep these players aligned and not having players go from school to school because they don't play or whatever the case may be. It's really interesting to talk about because, again, like I said, the transfer portal has been interesting with the reception that it's had and the overall general opinion now because of some other recent rule changes where they are introducing challenges to the NCAA, and I've even heard some reports that they could consider making the game going back to 4 quarters instead of 2 halves. It's, again, there's this general narrative where some fans think that these players maybe have too much power, and it's not a reflection of the game that they're used to see. And again, a lot of fans do have this tendency to latch on to nostalgia and want it back to how it should be, and sometimes ignore the facts of what it is now, right? And even with the transfer portal, there are some limitations on it where you do get your first time transferring, you are able to transfer wherever you want, and as a freshman or wherever, you could transfer wherever you want with no real consequences. Obviously, as a second time, not obviously, but as a second time transfer, you have to be granted a waiver, and again, that fluctuates on who's able to get waivers. Zakai Ziegler from Tennessee, a guard who's entering his 5th year, he was denied a waiver for similar reasons. So again, contracts play into this now because, again, it could limit some of the flexibility that people have, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Again, even to address this overall cap situation. And when you think of the $20 million that schools are going to be able to allocate equally to players, the first thing you might think is, wow, now there's some sort of competitive balance between, in basketball, let's say a Duke or a North Carolina, or a smaller school, I don't know, a Kennesaw State, a Norfolk State, for example. Those are really random examples. But now we're going to be able to pay players a certain amount or the same as some of these other schools are. I don't think it's necessarily that simple as it sounds because, again, there's still no limit on the third-party NIL money that these athletes can make. So if Nike and Jordan or these certain schools are still offering these guys money under the table, wherever, you still have that competitive advantage. And again, these schools aren't required to pay this up to this or they're not required to pay this whole $20 million, but that's just a maximum threshold that can be paid out. Obviously, there's still questions about how that money is going to be divided, incorporated into school's budget. But again, that's dependent on the school. I'm not here to legally break that down. Like I said, I'm here to pretty much put in perspective of like, what is this going to do for the transfer portal? And as the stages are advanced and this really comes into play, is this really going to make college basketball be another form of the NBA? Which I think people don't want, especially with the rule changes and everything else. And again, focusing on player empowerment, the NBA is one of the more player-focused leagues where they put pride on having their players have control over the decisions they make and not being really forced in the hand of owners and other things. The NCAA has still not done that. They have still not established this boundary to where college athletes, are still somewhat treated as employees the same way they are seen students. The NCAA, once it is still more focused on them being considered students and less as employees, even though they make these schools majority of their money. It's still an issue that they still haven't tackled. And even with this ability for schools to pay their athletes individually, I'm still sure there are going to be some issues and some loopholes where certain players are felt that they are more valuable than others. And again, having this outline of how valuable you really are, where there could be a 12th man on Duke who feels, okay, I'm worth this much and this much and this much, and the 7th man feels the same thing. And again, that's where contracts come into play, because you could sign someone and say, yeah, you have to be here for 2 years. And then after that, if you want to leave, or if you want to leave before that contract ends, you have to get bought out or whatever. So it's an interesting discussion. There's obviously tons of information on the legal breakdowns of what this means. But I do think this has some big implications to what the transfer portal can look like in the future, and a general overall look of how the college basketball landscape, again, for even men and women's, is shaping out, and is it really becoming the NBA? Because with some of these changes, people can make that argument. That's going to do it. That's the deep cut. When we come back, we're going to step right into Run That Back, and I'll see you guys in a second. All right, so on Run That Back this week, we're going to revisit a clip that came from about maybe 1 to 2 weeks ago, where Colin Cowherd, who has his own show on Fox, and Nick Wright, who's a kind of the lead of First Things First, also on Fox, they talked about Caitlin Clark, her being out and her being hurt, and kind of what that meant for the ratings in the NBA. And Colin basically compared her popularity to other athletes on this global scale and what that really meant. So let's hop into that.
And I was thinking about this. How many NBA players, and I know Caitlin Clark is an athlete, but she's like beyond that now. She kind of transcends sports. She's like, it's racial, it's political, it's polarizing, it's a lot of things.
Yes. How
many NBA players are more famous than Caitlin Clark? LeBron, Steph, absolutely.
Maybe Durant.
That's what I put. I wrote down KD maybe.
Yeah.
In 1 year, out of women's basketball, for a horrible team when she arrived, outside of LeBron and Steph, she is the most well-known basketball player currently playing in the United States.
Oh, yes. And I don't think that's close. Like, I think I might have said this to you last year, that I thought the most famous basketball player under 30 was Caitlin Clark.
See, I found this to be very interesting. The first thing I thought was, well, yes, LeBron and Steph are more popular, even though it might be closer than you think. And then after that, there's a gap. I mentioned last week how the NBA is still trying to be able to make these new stars that they have globally recognizable. If you pick up someone or talk to someone who hasn't watched basketball in 10 years and show him some of these newer stars, no disrespect to Tyrese Halliburton and Anthony Edwards, they don't know who they are. They know who Caitlin Clark is. So I found that to be very interesting, especially for basketball, because again, if you compare it to other sports, global athletes, where soccer, it kind of doesn't come close, or even American football, basketball in its own lane, if you take the 5 most popular basketball players in the NBA that are under 30, like Nick said, if it's Ant or Tyrese or Ja or Cade or whoever, none of their popularity comes close to Caitlin Clark, simply because you had that whole women's demographic that you have to account for, and the fact that a lot of men think she is awesome for the game. So yeah, when the more you think about it, she most likely is the 3rd most popular basketball player in the world, which is crazy to say. So that's this episode, or this week's Run That Back. When we come back, we will end off this week with Zay Unchecked, where there's some big news around the NBA. We'll be right back. All right, so this is breaking news as of today. The Memphis Grizzlies have traded Desmond Bane to the Orlando Magic for Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Cole Anthony, 4 unprotected first-round picks, and a first-round pick swap. So if I'm being completely honest, my initial reaction, I hate this for the Orlando Magic. Because my first thought is, the first thing I'm thinking of when I hear this deal is I think of the Mikal Bridges deal when he was sent to the Knicks last year for 5 first-round picks and a pick swap. And I'm like, if you're going to move that draft capital, and again, I'm aware that not all of these picks are top picks. A lot of these picks are later first-round picks. I'm aware of that before people start saying that. But that makes you revisit every time you talk about Mikal Bridges, that is what is thought of. So now with Desmond Bane, who is a guy who is a quality starter in the NBA. Man, he's more than a quality starter. He's a fringe all-star. But he's really, at best, your 3rd best guy, maybe your 2nd. So now, every time people look at the Magic, who could have maybe just built internally and kept maybe drafting and building their guys, they took the big swing. And this was the big swing. I don't know. I think if you're going to go all in, you could have gotten a better player. And maybe that player wasn't available. But I'm just struggling to wrap my head around you sacrificing that draft capital for a guy who is your 3rd best player. I mean, you did keep Anthony Black. You did keep some other guys, so credit for that. But in the long term, are we going to look at this the way we look at, again, maybe the Rudy Gobert trade and the Mikal Bridges trade, and now Desmond Bane, guys who are very good players and potentially all-stars or whatever, but they don't move the needle? That's my initial reaction. I don't know. Maybe things will change. I could see it from both sides. I was really thinking from the Magic perspective. From the Grizzlies, are they going to blow it up? Are they going to stand pat with what they got? I don't know. We will see. But that is this week's episode of Zay Knows Ball, the weekly rundown. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.